Today, we're talking to Jack Langerak, a longtime teaching artist and teaching artist administrator. We'll be talking about building a TA career, arts partnerships, grant writing, and even becoming an administrator. Join us. Hi, I'm Larry Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to Brush with Knowledge. Throughout this series, we're going to explore the role of teaching artistry as a tool to transform education and ignite your imagination. In each episode, we'll highlight the work of a different teaching artist and offer ideas that you can use in your own classrooms, meetings, and even the larger communities you serve and live in. Today, we're talking with Jack Langerak, a highly experienced and dedicated educator, artist, and arts administrator. With a career spanning several decades, Jack has played an instrumental role in shaping the landscape of arts education in Rochester and beyond. Currently, he shares his wealth of knowledge as a teacher at the Eastman School of Music Institute for Music Leadership, guiding the next generation of artists and teaching artists. His extensive background includes leadership positions in various educational organizations, providing him with unique insights into the world of arts education. Jack has held nearly every position a working teaching artist can have and has made a lasting impact on the lives of countless students, including serving as a mentor to many young teaching artists, such as myself, when I started my career as a teaching artist with young audiences of Rochester. Well, welcome, Jack.
Wow. Thank you, Larry. That was quite an introduction. I'm excited to be with you and pleased to get our conversation going.
Yeah, I will say the intro, anybody that's listened to the other episodes knows that I haven't usually gone that far. But as I said, you were a mentor of mine as I was getting started. And you do have a very long career doing this, so I'd love to give everybody a little bit of background.
Sure.
And I'm interested in the journey that got you to where you are today. I look at your accomplishments, and you started out studying English, theater, and somehow ended up into this whole world of teaching artistry.
Yeah. It was a very interesting route. I had been involved in theater and music in high school. I was fortunate enough to get some roles in the plays that we did, and I played trombone, not particularly well, but well enough to be in the band and to be in the marching band, and I enjoyed that and followed through with that when I got to college. I went to college really determined to become an English teacher, and when I hit my very first education course, I decided that maybe I need to rethink this. And so I became just a flat-out English major, but I was able to incorporate two other loves of my life, other than English, and that would be music and theater. And so I had a double minor, music and theater, and that opened up all kinds of things for me. When I got back to graduate school, I realized that I was maybe a little more mature in terms of my approach to education courses, and so I ended up becoming a master's in education, English, and I ultimately got my certification and went to work.
So you said that you started out thinking you were going to be an English teacher.
Yeah.
Decided to rethink that whole thing and do something different, but you still went back to it. So you were always drawn towards education.
Yeah. And that really was because of two English teachers I had in high school. High school was a time for me when I was kind of all over the place. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't really consider what a career I might have or what I should be thinking about. But the two English teachers who directed me in plays found something in me that I didn't realize existed, and they found something of value, and I came to slowly realize that maybe there was something there, and I came to sort of idolize the way those two treated me and the way they respected what was really very raw material at the time, and just made me feel good about something that I didn't really even realize I had.
So hints towards the whole teaching artist thing right from there. Those hints at the rawness of your teaching skills and abilities and the interests and things that you could pull in, I'm assuming, is some of what they recognized.
Yeah, I guess, they were very wonderful people. They were just terrific. And they also, we weren't just, it wasn't just teacher-student relationship. It was friendly, it was warm, and it was encouraging. And I really appreciated that at a time when I needed it.
So at this point, as a teacher, you're leaving grad school, you're back into the whole teaching world. Was the term teaching artist something that you were familiar with, that people used? Was it even on your radar?
No, not at all. But I was always, music and theater, I was always very drawn to the arts. It's something just inside of me that I cannot, it's an inevitable part of me. I have quite a response to all kinds of arts. My aesthetic being is very alive. And so I engaged teaching artists before that term was even anything. But I had access to young audiences, the roster, and I saw people there that I would love to have in my classroom. And so I did what I needed to do to let people know and identified some funding that might possibly support that and got to work. And so I just almost from the beginning, I encouraged that at any chance that I could.
All right. I want to come back to all of that in the teaching.
Sure.
I want to, just because I want to make sure everybody has a good sense of who you are and where this comes from. There were some other roles that you took on later.
Yeah.
Arts administrator.
Right.
I know you from young audiences. That's where we had met.
Right.
But there was Wolf Trap. There was, I'm even blanking on that. I remember looking at the list and going, wow, so you were an arts administrator. You were on nonprofit artist boards or arts boards.
Yeah.
And you have been a mentor to many. So that's kind of, the big picture of all of the various things I've seen you doing. At some point, the term teaching artist was introduced to you.
Yeah.
And so, we've heard a little bit about your background and your thinking and the whole process and trying to bring the arts into everything. Mm-hmm. What did a teaching artist mean to you when you heard about it? Did that satisfy what you were looking for as a teacher?
Yeah, it's an interesting term. It's an interesting combination of words, teaching artist, And so as I mentioned, I got to using some folks who were on the young audiences roster. I was privileged enough to be able to have them in my classrooms, and some of them repeatedly. And we became very good friends. And I also, in that process, got to know young audiences as an organization a little bit better. And I became a member of its board. So that was my very first board membership. And after, I think maybe just a couple of years on that board, I became the board president. And my career was moving along, and I was moving along in terms of age and the number of years I'd spent teaching already. And so when I retired from teaching, I stepped off of the board as board president, and I became the associate director of young audiences. I was well enough acquainted with the organization and had been a part of it as a board member for some time already. So I knew the ins and outs, and I was very pleased to be able to step right into that job upon my retirement.
Now, I know a word you've used a whole bunch of times already is friendly, that kind of feeling. And that's what I remember most. So, even today, I will often have conversations with other teaching artists or other artists in different fields. And there seems to be frequently an adversarial thing between teaching artists and administrators. But I never got that with you. That friendly thing was always what was there. I remember getting phone calls with, hey, can you come in so we can chat about something? I actually want to bring you on to an advisory committee that we're making.
Right.
We artists need to be part of the scene.
Yeah.
And, administrators can't just send artists out. They have to understand what artists need. They have to be part of the whole thing. Yeah. Partnerships seem to be a huge thing for you, not just the partnership between the administrators and the teaching artists, the mentors, but arts partnerships in classrooms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that all developed as a result of a special initiative that was launched by the New York State Council on the Arts, and it was called the Empire State Partnerships Project. And this was, while it existed, the largest, most effective arts and education program in any state across the country. And it was very active, and the New York State Council on the Arts had identified special funding to support that program. Quite a bit of a number of different things had to come together in order for that program to be put in place. And one of the things was a challenge from the Board of Regents when they developed a new set of learning standards. And for the very first time, those learning standards included the arts. And they included the 4 major art forms, so music and visual art, and dance and theater. Now, schools were stuck. How are we going to have our students meet theater arts? We don't have a theater teacher in our building. How are we going to have students meet the dance arts? We don't have a dancer on board. So the Commissioner of Education and the chairman of the board of the New York State Council on the Arts got together, and they began a conversation about a special project. And the head of the Arts and Education program at NYSCA, New York State Council on the Arts at that time, was Hollis Hedrick, a very thoughtful, intuit, excellent administrator, but also somebody who really understood what was needed from the beginning. And so a project was launched, the ESP, Empire State Partnership Project, and this was in the late 90s, I think. And the promise was that organizations interested in engaging in partnerships in schools could petition the NYSCA for grants, and that the grants would potentially last for 4 years. You would have to rewrite your proposal every year. You didn't get the refunding automatically. You had to petition for it every year. But 4 years were essentially guaranteed if you played the cards right. And each year, the potential funding you could get would increase. And so your first year, you began, and it was all about arts partnerships. Now, this was where the question began. So it's not a term that I had engaged with before, and so we all learned as we went. And arts partnerships really meant a partnership between a classroom teacher and a teaching artist. And those two would be given time to do some planning about what it is they might like to do together on behalf of their students and on behalf of learning. And they would then write that up in program design, and they would hopefully be funded in order to do that. And so what happened was that each year the project grew. Now, and I'm going to stay on this for just a little bit because the Empire State Partnership Project also insisted that the field get together. And this was an incredible moment. So every year, the entire field, everybody who had an ESP grant got together. The first couple of years we were at Sarah Lawrence College and in the summertime for a week. And there was a program. We learned from each other. We shared our work. But there was also, we also met during the school year. We would meet as what became known as RLNs, or Regional Leadership Networks. So all of the ESP grants in the Rochester area, which, and there were a number of them, would get together with the ESP grants in Buffalo and the ESP grants in Jamestown and Niagara Falls, and we would meet as a sort of Western New York group. And there were others like that regionally across the state. And what that helped us recognize is that we loved hearing about each other's projects, and we loved being inspired by other teaching artists. We networked like crazy. We had peer-to-peer investigations of each other's work. We developed protocols so we could talk to each other about these things safely without upsetting anyone. And it was amazing. And I think that's one of the first times that we got a sense that being a teaching artist was developing as a profession. And because there was enough money for teaching artists to have a steady work, and also the standards that needed to be met by the teaching artists were increasing from year to year. And as I mentioned, the initial RFP suggested that you could have maybe 4 years of this going. It extended itself for years after that. It lasted 10 years. And so by that time, everybody in the field knew everybody, and we were quite a community. And it was a very, very exciting time to be involved.
Can you think of one of those projects that you learned about hearing from others, or that you were involved in, that stands out, that's an example? Because I love this whole thing where, yes, standards help guide, but it was a partnership thing. It wasn't saying to the teaching artist, you're going to do this. It was, here are our goals, here's how we're going to get there. Yeah. So I'm very interested, especially for anybody listening that is not really familiar with projects that might take place, something that stands out.
I have a difficult time selecting because there are many standouts, but I will highlight one, and that is an organization that actually got started in ESP. The organization didn't really exist until after 9/11, and it was built at that time as a response to 9/11, and it is still in existence in New York City. It's called Epic Theater. And the people involved in that project were dedicated theater artists doing terrific work, primarily in somewhat classical theater, and doing it in schools with students and getting them up and performing and doing investigations of what it means to be an actor, what it means to be a performer. But what they added to that mix was that as an artist, they also had obligations. These are the students that they were, inculcating this kind of thinking into. They had an obligation also as a citizen. So they had this whole idea of teaching their charges to consider being citizen artists. And I thought that was really, really powerful.
Right. More than just, hey, we're introducing you to the arts and exposing you to the arts.
Right.
Here's how, as another guest that I spoke to previously put it, the superpower of art.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, it's great that you're engaged in the arts, and it's meaningful work. They were doing in-depth investigations of the plays that they were working on, but the students embraced this, and they really felt a sense of responsibility. And they grew immensely as a result of that. And their work goes on, incidentally. Yeah.
So the landscape is different now. Mm-hmm. We don't have the same funding that you're talking about from that. But somebody trying to create a program, whether a classroom teacher or an artist that wants to get into classrooms, community settings, whatever, how do you find and identify potential partnerships? How does somebody getting into this approach this?
Yeah, this is a very challenging thing now because the the landscape is a little more jagged these days. But the internet is a great friend. And you mentioned that I teach at the Eastman School of Music, and I teach incredibly gifted and talented musicians to consider and this is putting it kind of brusquely, consider what they might do if they don't get the first year violin in the Cleveland Symphony. What are the other opportunities that they have? And so I encourage them to come up with other ideas of how they might address their work, and then I teach them how they might find funding to support that. And but the idea is that to consider their roles as artists, and to make sure that they are being fulfilled by their work as they approach a profession that might require a little more digging for them in order for them to land into something.
What other recommendations do you make for them then? They're in school still. Is it something, do you say, if you want to get into teaching artistry, are there teaching artist programs that are out there at the college level to direct them to? Or do you recommend getting an education degree?
Yeah, a long time ago, when I was still working at Young Audiences, I directed a program in partnership with the Eastman School of Music. This is before I became a professor there. And I encouraged or selected 2 chamber groups, and I got together with them, and I encouraged them to think about developing a program that they might be able to deliver in school settings. So there's that. But to get back to your direct question, how do you get involved if you're a teaching artist? Well, I think one of the things that's true is you go to the internet and you just put in a request for connections to teaching artists. And one of the things you will find is an organization called TA Rock right here in Roch. And, you and I know a little bit about that organization. And it is an organization that hosts professional development for teachers, that also encourages new folks to get involved. And so it's a welcoming place, and there are others like it, and there are also other organizations that you don't think of as necessarily as teaching artist organizations, but that use them. So theater companies frequently have teaching artists associated with them. I'm a teaching artist for Jiva, and opera companies, and if you're because my students are from all over the country, all over the world, really. So arts organizations and major performing organizations in their communities, chances are, if they make a connection there, they might either hook up with teaching artists that they already use, or be invited to dip their toes in the water.
So I have not, since I've started this podcast, I've actually not talked about Teaching Artist Rock. So,
okay.
the very quick, no, I mean, for me,
yeah.
like I make sure not to bring up my own stuff.
Okay, well.
However,
yeah.
no, I think it is, I wanted to give a little background on that because it is an interesting, the model there was really, when we started, there was no model that we said we needed to have. And when I say we, it was a bunch of us former Young Audiences artists that got together and sat around the conference table and said, we need to do something as a group, and we don't know what it is. And I invited you to join us, and you came along, and I managed to get you onto our board when, I didn't think we were starting an organization. I really thought that this was a bunch of teaching artists that were going to be a loose network that was going to give referrals back and forth.
Right.
And what we learned in trying to do this and trying to make all of the connections with other organizations, with funders, was that nobody would take us seriously. Everybody said, well, are you a 501c3?
Yeah, right.
I said, no, we're just a group of artists.
Yeah.
And And I remember the reason I bring up that story is that you, with all of your experience in all of these organizations, you had called me at one point and said, okay, I think it's great that you're all getting together, but tell me that you're not starting another nonprofit. and we had a long conversation about neither of us thought there was a need for another nonprofit, but it turned out that, again, to get the recognition of funders, to get that funding to come in, we needed to establish some organization.
Right. And you have. And I was very pleased to be a part of the preliminary conversations there. But, what really struck me, though, at that time was that there were a good-sized group of very gifted and talented, experienced teaching artists who were bereft. They were just left hanging. And, we have to, I guess, maybe explain that young audiences ran into some difficulties and ended up having to close up shop. And so now we have all of these teaching artists who, many of them have made essentially careers out of their work. And now they no longer have these automatic school connections. And so conversations were started, and there was this sort of reluctance to form an organization. Nobody wanted to be an administrator. Nobody wanted to step up and do that kind of work. But the conversations continued, and an avenue was developed. And so we have now a fully recognized 501c3 called TA Rock, Teaching Artists Rochester. And I'm very pleased to be speaking to the executive director of the organization.
And I will say it has been an interesting adventure.
Yeah, yes, it has. Absolutely.
Not what I thought I was getting into. Mm-hmm. I actually, I resisted for a long time, and then as I was starting to think about it, I asked a few of the other artists that had previously been on the Young Audiences roster to talk me out of doing this. And just last week, one of those artists, Doug Rougeau, walked up to me and he said, it just occurred to me when you asked me to talk you out of doing this, you meant it.
Very funny.
And I absolutely did.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a break from talking about the business stuff and let's, giving people an idea of what teaching artistry can look like. Do you have something that you can teach everybody here and give everybody a chance
you have warned me that you were going to ask that question. And so, I also work as a theater teaching artist and I'm a theater guy. And so I actually have two very quick things. And, if you are a teaching artist coming into a classroom and the teacher has said that you're a theater person, the kids in the classroom may already be shuddering. Oh my goodness, what am I going to be asked to do? And I have some reservations about it. I'm not an actor. And so you need to kind of warm the situation up and make people feel a little more comfortable. So I frequently begin with something that I call simultaneous conversation. And what that means is I divide the group up into groups of two. And if there's an uneven number, I encourage the teacher to partner with one of the students, and so that we have everybody engaged. And I instruct the groups of two to decide on a topic that they both know something about that they could talk about. And so I say, all right, everybody have a topic? Okay, now here's the deal. When I give you the signal, you have to start talking about what it is you've identified. But the special part of this is that you must both be talking at the same time, and you cannot stop talking. So, and I will let you go for a little bit, and then I'll say stop, and we'll do the next phase of this. So I give the signal, everybody starts talking, and it's a little crazy, and maybe a little tentative at first. I let that go for a minute or so, and then I say stop, and then we switch partners. We switch partners and we do the same thing. Please identify something you can talk about. On my signal, you'll start talking. But this time around, I want you to remember that gestures are an important part of what you do, and that facial expressions and things like that. So make it a little more dramatic, make it a little more meaningful. So we do that kind of thing for a couple of times. So that's one thing. And if you have a really good group, you can, and they're really having a great time, and you're ready to, you think they're ready for something else, you can even ask them at one of the iterations of this to sing what it is they're doing, what it is they're talking about. So it's a lot of fun. It warms things up, and it gives people a sense of security. And then the second thing I have is the very first sort of performance piece is something called neutral scenes. And neutral scenes are, they're just a page long. It's some dialogue, and the characters are character X and character Y, and it doesn't run for very long. And I, again, team people up in the groups of two, and the problem with the neutral scene is that it really is about nothing. And it's very difficult when you read through it. What is this about? And so it is the Ernest Hemingway theory of literature that the written word is the 1/5 of the iceberg that's above the water. The real meaning is the 4/5 below. And so I ask them to think about what this scene might be about. Please supply the subtext. And in some cases, I give the same scripts to a couple of different groups. And so we have different interpretations of the same thing, the same words. And it's easy to perform. It's an improv, but you don't have to worry about what you're going to say because you've got the script in front of you and you perform it with the script in hand. It's perfectly fine. And so we get some really interesting takes on what these things might mean when they really mean very little. But you have to supply the subtext. You can make it very dramatic. You can also the blocking and moving around and things like that is very interesting too.
Fantastic. Excuse me. I actually, I love those. I want to play with those some more. In fact, I used to have a show called Solo. It was a 2-person show.
Yeah.
And you described it perfectly. It was the tagline for it was 2 people performing solo simultaneously.
Oh yeah, that's great.
And we did the show and we interacted, by accident. We would cross each other. We would, and it was like everybody was watching 2 stories happening.
Yeah,
so
it sounds terrific.
I want to play with both of those some more now that you've talked about that. So getting back to the more serious side of teaching artistry, one of your specialties is funding and acquiring the funding. So I said I'm not approaching this from the stuff I need. I lied. I'm asking you this now for me.
Okay.
I want to know how to get funded, the grants, the private funders. What advice can you give?
Well, it's when you mention the word grant writing, it sounds onerous to everyone. They immediately go, "Oh no," But I remind my students that, and the course I teach at Eastman is really essentially about fundraising, and grant writing is a good part of that. So I remind them first of all I ask them where's the money coming from, and to identify the source of funding. Frequently, it's public funding. And then, so that would be like the New York State Council on the Arts, and every state has its arts council, and there are local entities. There are re-granting state money from the New York State Council on the Arts, local entities, arts councils that do that, and it's all public money. There's the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. Their job essentially is to distribute funding. So I remind them that NISCA, its job, for all the fact it provides guidance to the field and structure and so on, their big job every year is to distribute public funding across the state. So they have an interest in doing this. And so they would welcome a well-written grant.
And part of that job, I was recently told directly by somebody at NEA, is answering questions about how to fill out that document that I know.
And that's one of the things that I also suggest that if you have an idea that you want to go for funding for, that you contact the funder, make contact, and explain what it is you'd like to do, and then ask for some sort of direction, and then ask for permission to, once I get busy writing this, if I stumble over something, can I call you again? All right. So that's a very good technique, because one of the things you're doing is you're establishing, no matter who the funder is, that you have a project, and they now know your name, and their project is sort of on their radar, very unofficially. And now you're calling and asking for some further advice, and you follow that advice, and you're establishing a relationship. Could very well be the person you're speaking to is going to be part of the decision-making process. And so making that contact, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I know that I was always afraid of funding, of asking for grant money, and I've learned in this project right here, I mean, aside from everything that TA Rock has done, this here is an example of, I talked to the funder, I asked for information, and followed through, and here we are having this discussion. And yeah, you need to not be afraid to ask. So I'll ask everybody to listen at the very end when I say you can help support this podcast continuing. I'm serious about that too.
Sure, right. But a couple of other things about grant writing I think that are significant, and that is that you need to make the case, and when people groan at the idea of grant writing, it's because they think grant writing is some kind of specialized kind of writing that distills things into very academic kinds of language. And it's not true. You just need to make the case. There's something that I refer to as the need statement. You want to do this project? Why is your project necessary? Why should we do it? Why do we have to do it? Convince us, and then there, of course, is program design. Your program design has to make sense. And so lay it out, provide a timeline, what happens when, and who's involved. And, but the program design is critical. And then if they're going to give you money, they want to know if you're successful, or have you, how did it go? And so your assessment plan is also very important. And, when I teach this at Eastman, I don't have time to do a complete grant project writing with them. There are too many elements. But I do the 4 or 5 key ones, some of which I've mentioned here just now.
Now, you have talked about the things that you've done, and it really came out how much you care about teaching when you were talking about teaching. You ended up as an administrator. Why do you? I mean, you're in the classroom again now, teaching. Yeah. You're teaching arts administration.
Yeah.
Where are you happiest? What's your?
Well, I like nothing better than to teach, and I am blessed with having had a full teaching career as an English and theater teacher. I directed many plays over my full career, and that was extremely exciting and a lot of fun for me. And as I became more engaged with young audiences, and started using more young audiences, artists in my classroom, and encouraging others to sign them on as well, I became eventually the school district's arts and education coordinator. So now I was teaching fewer classes and spending some time administering the arts and education budget across the district, every one of our school buildings at all levels. And so then it was just a natural segue when I retired to step into a continuing administrative role, which was very similar at young audiences. And I'm not, I don't have much hesitancy about being an administrator. It doesn't sound as awful to me as it might to others. And sometimes I understand why that word makes people shudder a little bit. But I try to be a warm and welcoming and engaging individual. And, what it is for me really is the mission. And that's what it is for you too, I think.
Absolutely.
And so I feel strongly about the mission. I think it's a very important thing to be doing. And I think I've seen too often children light up in classrooms when there's a teaching artist in the room. And particularly when at the Empire State Partnerships, when there's a long relationship that can develop, when it's residency work we're doing, and there are going to be 15 contacts with this classroom, and you're coming back every twice a week for a number of weeks, and those students so look forward to you coming into the room, and they know that's going to be something special and interesting, and you're going to get up out of the desks and do something, and their learning increases, their motivation increases, their attendance increases, their ability to think more deeply about what's going on. All of these things are, and I just think that's an incredibly important mission, and it needs to be made available to all students all the time.
I agree.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, for just a minute, the future of teaching artistry.
Good.
What do you want to see? What hasn't happened yet? What programs need to be developed? And I know I said just a minute. This is probably impossible.
One of the things I'm really excited about that's happened as a result of largely the Empire State Partnership Project and its greater impact, even though it doesn't exist any longer, is that the profession has become much more of a professional field. And so there is, growing out of Empire State Partnership projects was the Association of Teaching Artists. And this was an organization designed to promote teaching artistry, to have teaching artists support each other along the way, to network across the state and so on. And turns out that there were similar organizations like that in other states. And there now have been negotiations to meld all of these together somehow. And there is now the Teaching Artist Guild, which is a national organization, and the Association of Teaching Artists that was local to New York State primarily has now become a part of that. So that's another thing, I think, for someone interested in becoming a teaching artist. Take a look at the Teaching Artist Guild website, and there are some guidance available for you there.
All right. Now, before we end,
okay,
I know that having been in this for a long time, you talked to me about some of the teaching artists that you have met over the years and some that are no longer here.
Yeah.
And I know you wanted to talk for a minute about...
Yes. So we're at the end of our conversation, I guess. But so, I see this as an opportunity to remember two of my truly great friends. They're teaching artists. They were teaching artists. They were teaching artists in theater, like me, and they weren't necessarily always working as partners. They did their own projects, but they were lost to us way too soon. Their work was at extremely high level. They insisted on this. They worked very, very hard, and they also had hearts of gold. They were good friends of mine, and they were Arthur Brown and Barnetta Carter. And they passed away a number of years ago, but I still remember them and think of them very frequently, particularly in relation to the kind of work that we do. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to
absolutely. I think
to have the field kind of remember them.
I think it's really important to remember those that have had an impact and helped bring us to where we are.
I do too.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining me today. I have really enjoyed the conversation.
I have too, Larry. Thank you so much. And, I have, in our conversations around the beginning of Teaching Artists Rock, I have pointed out to you several times in sort of candid conversations that your sort of natural leadership ability is what has allowed Teaching Artists Rock to take shape. And so my thanks to you for making that happen. And I know that the teaching artists involved feel the same way.
Thank you. To learn more about everyone on our program, follow the links in the show notes and at brushwithknowledge.com. This podcast has been launched with funding from Genesee Valley Council on the Arts and the New York State Council on the Arts. Recording has been done at Rockvox Recording and Production. To learn how you can help support the creation of future episodes, please follow links in the show notes or visit brushwithknowledge.com.